Ezekiel Cole sought refuge on the ridge specifically to escape humanity, finding solace in the gale force winds that howled like a wounded animal. However, a broken collarbone forced him to rely on others for basic survival. His solitude was shattered when a woman arrived through the November sleet, not a cook, but a fugitive with frost-bitten hands, stolen footwear, and a bounty large enough to purchase the entire county. Ezekiel struck the wedge with the back of the maul. Wood splintered a sharp crack that echoed off the granite teeth of the canyon. Pain flared from his right shoulder down to his fingertips, a hot, bright wire pulling taut. He dropped the maul. He stood there in the ankle-deep snow, breathing hard, watching his own breath plume and vanish in the grey afternoon air. Winter was coming early. The sky had the flat, bruised look of iron. He bent down, favouring his left side, and tossed the split pine into the wheelbarrow. It was a pathetic pile. 3 weeks ago, a spooked mule had pinned him against a corral fence down in Red Creek. The bone had snapped clean. Doc Higgins had set it tight, wrapped him up, and told him he wouldn't be swinging an axe until the spring thaw. Ezekiel had paid the man in furs, walked to the general store, and pinned a note to the board. Need a hand for the winter. Cooking, hauling, keeping the fire. $30 a month, and a warm bed. See Ezekiel Cole on the ridge. He knew the locals had laughed. Ezekiel Cole was a ghost story, they told their kids. A sullen, scarred man who came down from the mountain twice a year to trade pelts for coffee and gunpowder. Nobody was walking 10 miles up a vertical incline to spend 6 months snowed in with a giant who barely spoke. Ezekiel wheeled the wood toward the cabin. The structure was squat and heavy, built of thick lodgepole pines chinked with river mud. It wasn't pretty, but it held the heat. He shoved the door open, the leather hinges groaning. He was pouring a cup of chicory coffee from the tin pot on the stove when the dogs started up. Not a hunting bark. A warning. Ezekiel set the cup down. He didn't reach for the Winchester by the door. Instead, he slipped the heavy Colt from its holster hanging on the chair and slid it into the waistband of his trousers, pulling his heavy flannel shirt over the grip. He stepped out onto the porch. The wind bit at his cheeks. Coming up the switchback was a figure. Small. Stumbling. The snow was blowing harder now, stinging the eyes, but Ezekiel could see the erratic sway of their gait. The dogs, 2 massive wolfhound mixes, were circling the stranger, snapping at the air, but keeping their distance. Ezekiel gave a sharp whistle. The dogs fell back, sitting on their haunches, watching. The figure reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. It was a woman. She was wrapped in a canvas duster that was 3 sizes too big, the hem dragging in the snow. Underneath, she wore men's trousers and heavy work boots that looked practically new, a jarring contrast to the rest of her ragged appearance. Her face was half hidden by a woolen scarf, but her eyes were visible. They were dark, feral, and locked onto him with the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. "You Ezekiel Cole!" Her voice was hoarse, ruined by the cold. "I am." "Saw the note." She took a step forward, swayed, and caught herself. "I can cook. I can haul." Ezekiel didn't move. He took in the bruised purple skin around her left eye, the unnatural way she held her right arm close to her ribs. "You walked 10 miles up the pass in a squall for a cooking job. I need the money. You need a doctor." "I don't need a damn doctor!" The flash of anger in her voice was quick and sharp. She pulled the scarf down, revealing a sharp jaw and the chapped, bleeding lips. "I need a warm bed and the $30. You want to cook, or do you want to freeze?" Ezekiel studied her. There was a lie hanging between them, thick as the falling snow. Women from Red Creek didn't wear stolen boots. They didn't have eyes that constantly tracked the tree line, and they certainly didn't hike up to the ridge alone in November. He should tell her to turn around. He should send her back down the mountain before the drifts got too high. But his shoulder throbbed with a sickening rhythm, and the woodpile was painfully low. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, a fraction of a second. "Abigail." "All right, Abigail." Ezekiel stepped aside and nudged the heavy oak door open with his boot. "Get inside before you freeze to death on my porch. You can start by making supper." She walked past him. She smelled of wet wool, stale sweat, and fear. Her name wasn't Abigail. He knew it by the third day. Ezekiel watched her from the corner of the room where he was mending a leather harness. She was at the stove stirring a pot of venison stew. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested she was used to tight spaces, but there was a stiffness to her shoulders. "Hand me the salt," she said, not looking back. "On the shelf above your head," he replied. She reached up. The oversized sleeve of her flannel shirt slid down her forearm. Ezekiel stopped pulling the waxed thread through the leather. Around her right wrist was a deep, raw ring of chafed skin. It was scabbed over in places, bruised black and yellow in others. It was the exact width of a shackle. She felt his eyes on her. She yanked the sleeve down, grabbed the salt, and threw a handful into the pot. Her back was rigid. Ezekiel looked back down at the harness. "Stew smells burnt." "It's not burnt," she snapped. "It's caramelized. It's ruined. Then cook it yourself." She slammed the wooden spoon onto the cast-iron stove. She stood there breathing heavy, waiting for the blow, waiting for the screaming. Ezekiel calmly tied off the knot in the leather bit, the thread loose, and set the harness aside. He walked over to the stove, picked up the spoon, and scraped the bottom of the pot. He took a taste. It tasted like ash and old blood. "Needs more salt," he said quietly, handing her back the spoon. He walked back to his chair. He didn't ask about the wrist. He didn't ask about the bruises fading on her ribs. He recognized the look in her eyes because he saw it in the mirror every morning. She was a ghost running from a grave. Her real name was Josephine. She whispered it in her sleep 2 nights later. She was thrashing on the pallet near the hearth, tangled in the heavy wool blankets, fighting off hands only she could see. "No!" she gasped. "Joe, my name is Joe. Let go." Ezekiel, sitting awake by the window with a cup of water, watched the firelight play across her face. "Josephine." He filed it away. By the end of the second week, the snow had piled 3 feet high against the door. The world outside was a howling white void. The cabin became a pressure cooker of proximity. They moved around each other like 2 stray dogs forced into the same cage, avoiding sudden movements, ignoring the tension. Jo was a terrible cook. She burned the bread. She oversalted the pork. But she was ruthless with the woodpile. Despite her slender frame and her bruised ribs, she took the axe and swung it with a violent, rhythmic fury. Ezekiel watched her from the window one afternoon. She wasn't just chopping wood, she was killing something. Every swing of the maul was a blow against a warden, a judge, a past mistake. When she came back inside, her face flushed and her chest heaving, he handed her a mug of coffee. "You're going to break the handle swinging it like that," he said. She took the mug, her fingers brushing his. Her hands were ice cold. "Wood's chopped, isn't it?" "It is." She took a sip of the coffee and winced. "You make terrible coffee, Cole. You make terrible stew, Joe." The name slipped out before he could catch it. The cabin went dead silent. The wind outside seemed to stop. Joe froze. Slowly she lowered the mug. Her right hand drifted instinctively towards the long butchering knife sitting on the counter. Her eyes darkened, the feral animal returning, cornered and lethal. "What did you call me?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Ezekiel didn't move. He kept his hands in plain sight, resting on the back of the chair. "You talk in your sleep. Abigail never fit you anyway." She gripped the handle of the knife. Her knuckles turned white. "What else did I say?" "Nothing that matters." "It matters to me." She took a step toward him. "Who are you going to tell Cole you're going to wait until the pass clears and run down to the marshal?" "I don't talk to marshals," Ezekiel said flatly. "I don't care what you did. I don't care who you killed, who you robbed, or what chain gang you slipped away from. You're keeping the fire hot and the wood chopped. That's what I'm paying you for." She stared at him, searching his scarred, impassive face for a lie. The heavy silence stretched. Finally, the tension leaked out of her shoulders. She let go of the knife and backed away, leaning against the rough wood of the wall. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. "I didn't kill anyone," she said, staring at the floorboards. "Not that they believe me. I didn't ask. I forged a bank draft." She said the words, spilling out like water from a cracked dam. $50 to get my little sister away from a man who liked to use his fists. The judge was the man's uncle. He gave me 10 years at the territorial prison. We were on a transport wagon near the gorge. Wheel broke. The guard fell. I took his keys and I ran. Ezekiel listened. He looked at the bruised, exhausted woman on his floor. $50, he murmured. Yeah. Ezekiel walked over to the stove, poured himself a cup of the terrible coffee, and sat back down. "I killed a man in Abilene," he said quietly. Joe looked up, surprised. "He was a card cheat." Ezekiel continued, staring into the black liquid in his cup. "Drew on me when I called him out. I was faster. Turned out he was the mayor's son, so I live up here." He took a sip of the coffee. He looked at her. "You make the bread tomorrow," he said. "Use less flour this time." Joe let out a breath that sounded like a half laugh, half sob. She rested her chin on her knees. "All right, Ezekiel. Less flour." The blizzard broke on the 18th day, leaving behind a silence so profound it made the ears ring. The sky cleared to a brilliant, blinding blue, but the temperature plummeted. It was the kind of cold that shattered trees and froze the lungs. Inside the cabin, the dynamic had shifted. The jagged edges between them had sanded down into a quiet routine. Joe learned how to make a decent biscuit. Ezekiel learned that Joe hated the dark, always ensuring a lantern was burning low even when they slept. She also watched him. When he thought she was occupied, he'd catch her eyes tracking the heavy iron lockbox he kept under his cot. He knew what she was thinking. $30 a month wasn't going to get her to California or Mexico. The lockbox held gold eagles, enough to buy a horse, a train ticket, and a new life. He wondered when she would try to take it. He hoped she wouldn't. It had been a long time since he liked having someone around. It happened on a Tuesday. Ezekiel was sitting in the armchair, his arm out of the sling for the first time, carefully rotating the shoulder. Joe was at the table mending a tear in his coat. The dogs erupted. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a vicious, snarling frenzy. Ezekiel was on his feet instantly, the pain in his shoulder forgotten. He grabbed the Winchester from the wall. "Get in the root cellar." He barked at Joe. She dropped the coat, her face pale. "What is it? Just do it!" He shoved the rug aside and yanked up the heavy wooden trapdoor. The smell of earth and potatoes wafted up. Joe didn't argue. She scrambled down the ladder. Ezekiel dropped the door shut, kicked the rug back over it, and dragged the heavy oak table over the spot. He checked the chamber of the rifle and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Struggling up the final switchback, leading a horse that was chest-deep in the drifts, was a man in a heavy buffalo coat. A silver star was pinned to his lapel, catching the harsh winter sunlight. It was Deputy Miller from Red Creek. "Hold the dogs, Cole," Miller shouted, his breath puffing in massive clouds. "I ain't here for trouble." Ezekiel whistled. The dogs backed off, growling low in their throats. Ezekiel kept the rifle casually pointed at the snow. Miller tied his exhausted horse to the porch rail and stomped up the steps. His mustache was frozen solid with icicles. "God almighty, it's cold enough to freeze hell." Miller grunted, beating his arms against his sides. "You got coffee in there, Ezekiel." "I do." Ezekiel didn't move from the doorway. "What brings the law up the ridge? In a freeze, Miller, you lose your way." "Wish I had." Miller pulled off a thick leather glove and rubbed his face. "Looking for a stray? Marshal sent telegrams all over the territory. Transport wagon crashed down near the gorge a few weeks back. 3 convicts got loose. We caught 2 of them froze solid in a barn near Oak Haven. Looking for the 3rd. Up here." Ezekiel asked, his face a mask of bored annoyance. "Nobody comes up here, Miller. You know that." I know. Miller sighed. "But she's a desperate one. Woman by the name of Mercer. Beat a guard half to death to get his keys. Marshall says she's dangerous." Ezekiel felt a muscle tick in his jaw. Beat a guard half to death. He remembered the fresh bruises on Joe's face when she arrived. The desperation. "Haven't seen anyone?" Ezekiel said smoothly. "Just me and the dog since the snow started." Miller peered past Ezekiel into the cabin. He saw the warm fire. He smelled the fresh biscuits Joe had pulled from the oven an hour ago. He saw 2 plates on the counter. "You expecting company coal?" Miller asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Ezekiel didn't flinch. "I eat a lot, Miller. Mending a broken bone takes fuel." Miller stood there for a long moment. He looked at the rifle in Ezekiel's hands. He looked at the dogs watching him with dead, hungry eyes. He knew Ezekiel Cole's reputation. If there was a fugitive in that cabin, Miller knew he wasn't riding back down the mountain alive if he pushed it. "Right," Miller said slowly, backing up a step. "Well, if you see her. Dark hair, scarred-up wrists. There's a $200 bounty on her head. Alive or dead. I'll keep my eyes open. You do that." Miller pulled his glove back on. "I'll be heading back down. Appreciate the hospitality." Ezekiel watched the deputy mount his horse and begin the brutal slog back down the trail. He stood on the porch until the man was nothing but a black speck against the white snow, ensuring he wasn't going to circle back. When he finally went inside, he locked the heavy door and slid the iron bar into place. He pushed the table aside and pulled open the trap door. Joe was standing at the bottom of the ladder. She had heard everything. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, waiting for the verdict. $200 was a lot of money, more than she thought she was worth. Ezekiel reached down and offered her his good hand. "Come on up," he said. "Biscuits are getting cold." She stared at his hand. Slowly she reached up and took it. His grip was strong, pulling her up out of the dark and back into the warmth of the cabin. She stood before him, the trapdoor closed beneath her feet. He said $200. I heard him. "You need money for the spring, for supplies." Ezekiel walked over to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. He looked at her, the way her shoulders were finally beginning to relax, the way the bruises on her face had faded to a pale yellow. "I need a cook," Ezekiel said softly. "Even a bad one." Joe took the mug. For the first time since she walked up the mountain, a genuine, quiet smile broke across her face. It changed her entirely, erasing the hardness revealing the woman beneath the convict. "I'll use less flour next time," she whispered. "See that you do." Outside, the wind began to howl again, throwing a sheet of ice against the windows. But inside, the fire burned bright, and for the first time in years, Ezekiel Cole didn't mind the sound of the storm. January came down on the ridge like a falling anvil. The days shrank to a few pale hours of grey light, and the nights stretched out long, cold, and heavy. The cabin smelled of damp wood smoke and the sharp metallic tang of gun oil. Ezekiel sat at the heavy oak table, the pieces of his Colt Navy spread out on a clean rag. He worked with slow, methodical precision. His right shoulder was no longer bound tight, though it ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm whenever the barometric pressure dropped. Joe was at the stove. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of her kneading dough had become the heartbeat of the cabin. "You're working it too hard," Ezekiel said, not looking up from the cylinder he was wiping down. "Bread's going to taste like a saddle blanket." Joe paused, her wrists coated in white dust. She brushed a stray strand of dark hair off her forehead with the back of her hand. "If you want light and fluffy coal, you should have hired a pastry chef from Boston. You hired a convict. You get heavy bread." "Just an observation. Keep them to yourself." She resumed her kneading, but her strokes were slightly softer. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer the brittle, dangerous wire of 2 strangers expecting a knife in the back. It was thicker now, a mutual, quiet observation. They had learned the geography of each other's habits. Joe knew Ezekiel drank his coffee boiling hot and slept with his hand resting inches from the floorboard, right above his rifle. Ezekiel knew Joe checked the window latches 3 times every night and hated the sound of the wind howling through the chimney. Ezekiel finished reassembling the Colt. The click of the cylinder locking into place was sharp in the quiet room. He slipped the gun into his holster, and grabbed his heavy buffalo coat from the peg. "Going to check the snare lines," he said, pulling a thick knit cap over his ears. "Might be a hare, might just be frozen pine cones." "How long?" Joe asked. 2 hours. Keep the fire up." He walked out, shutting the heavy door behind him. The sudden silence left in his wake was deafening. Joe stood at the counter. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the dough. Then slowly she looked across the room. Underneath Ezekiel's cot, partially obscured by a hanging wool blanket, was the heavy black iron lockbox. It had been calling to her for weeks. It hummed with the promise of distance, a train ticket to San Francisco, a horse fast enough to outrun a telegram. Safety. She walked over to the table where Ezekiel had been cleaning his gun. Lying next to the oily rag, sitting plain as day, was a small brass key. He had forgotten it. Or he hadn't. Joe stared at the key. The metal caught the flickering light of the hearth. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird. If she took it, she could be out the door in 10 minutes. She could strap on her boots, take his spare coat pack, the leftover venison, and start walking down the other side of the ridge. The side that led into the high desert, away from Red Creek. Away from the law. She reached out. Her fingers hovered over the cool brass. $50, the judge had said, his voice dripping with aristocratic contempt. 10 years hard labor. She remembered the feel of the shackles on her wrists, the chafed, bleeding skin, the sheer suffocating terror of the transport wagon, the man she had run from the guard with the heavy fists and the sour breath. She closed her eyes. Her fingers brushed the key. Then she thought of the trap door. She thought of Ezekiel standing on the porch with a rifle lying to a deputy to protect a woman he barely knew. She thought of the way he scraped the burnt bottom off the stew pot and ate it anyway. Joe exhaled a long, shuddering breath. She pulled her hand back. She turned away from the table, walked back to the counter, and punched the dough down with a sudden, fierce violence. 2 hours later, the door swung open. A gust of frigid air blew in, carrying a dusting of dry snow. Ezekiel stomped his boots on the threshold and tossed 2 stiff, frozen rabbits onto the washstand. He shrugged off his coat, his eyes immediately going to the table. The key sat exactly where he had left it. He looked at Joe. She was sweeping the floor, her back to him, the broom moving in tight, angry arcs. Ezekiel walked over to the table, picked up the key, and dropped it into his pocket. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The choice had been made, the contract signed in the silence of an empty room. "I'll skin the rabbits," he said quietly. "Make a stew. I promise not to burn it." Joe stopped sweeping. She looked over her shoulder, the fierce, defensive glare softening just a fraction. "Just don't over-salt it." March arrived not with a roar, but with a relentless, maddening drip. The snowpack on the roof began to bleed. Icicles the size of a man's arm snapped off the eaves and shattered on the porch. The world outside transformed from a pristine, frozen ocean into a slick, treacherous morass of black mud and rotting pine needles. The pass was opening. The isolation was ending. Ezekiel stood in the yard, holding them all. He wasn't wearing his sling. He swung the heavy iron head down in a perfect, brutal arc. The pine log split clean down the center, the halves tumbling into the mud. He rolled his right shoulder. It was stiff, protesting the exertion, but the bone held. He was whole again. From the porch, Joe watched him. She had a cup of coffee in her hands, letting the steam warm her face. The heavy winter clothes she had arrived in were gone, replaced by a simple cotton shirt and trousers she had tailored from one of Ezekiel's old pairs. The bruising on her face had long since faded, leaving behind sharp cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. Ezekiel sank the maul into the chopping block and walked over to the porch, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. "Wood's done," he said. "I can see that." Jo took a sip of her coffee. "You swing that thing like it owes you money." "It does." Ezekiel looked out down the switchback. The trail was visible now, a brown scar cutting through the melting white. "I have to go down to Red Creek." Jo went perfectly still. The easy banter vanished. "When tomorrow morning, we're out of coffee, out of flour, and low on salt. I have winter pelts to trade." He saw the fear flash in her eyes, quickly masked by a flat, deadpan stare. "Town," she said, testing the word like it was a rotten floorboard. "The telegraph office is in town." "It is." "Are you coming back, Ezekiel?" It was the most vulnerable question she had ever asked him. It hung in the damp spring air between them. Ezekiel rested his boot on the first step. He looked her dead in the eye. "I need a cook. My cooking is terrible. It's getting better." He turned and headed toward the shed to fetch the pelts. Ezekiel left before dawn. He saddled his roan gelding, loaded the pack mule, and rode down the mountain. The descent was treacherous, the mud sucking at the animal's hooves, but by midday he saw the smoke rising from the chimneys of Red Creek. The town was waking up from its winter hibernation. Wagons sloughed through the muddy main street. Ezekiel tied his horses in front of the mercantile and carried his bundles of fox and beaver pelts inside. He conducted his business in monosyllables. The shopkeeper, a nervous man named Miller, cousin to the deputy, weighed the furs, handed over the flour coffee sugar and a tin of peaches. Ezekiel threw in a new hunting knife with a bone handle lighter than a butcher's blade better balanced. He was loading the supplies onto the mule when a man stepped out of the saloon across the muddy street. The man wore a bowler hat and a long tailored canvas coat that looked out of place among the rough spun and leather of the locals. But it was his face that caught Ezekiel's attention. It was unnervingly pale, dominated by a thick, ropey scar that circled his throat like a fleshy collar. The man walked across the street, his boots sinking into the muck. He stopped near Ezekiel's mule. "You Ezekiel Cole!" The man's voice was a rasp, like two stones grinding together. Ezekiel didn't stop tightening the cinch on the pack saddle. "Who's asking?" "Name's Briggs, Pinkerton National Detective Agency." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He flicked it open. It was a crude sketch, but the dark eyes and sharp jaw were unmistakable. Underneath, in heavy black type, it read, "Wanted, Josephine Mercer, escape assault forgery, $500 reward." The bounty had gone up. Someone wanted her back badly. "Deputy Miller mentioned he rode up your mountain back in November." Briggs rasped. "Said you were mending a shoulder. Said you had an awful lot of food on the stove for a man living alone." "Mending bone takes fuel," Ezekiel said, using the exact phrase he'd given the deputy. He didn't look at the poster. "Winter's over, Cole. The thaw is here. Law says any man harboring a fugitive faces federal charges." Briggs leaned in the smell of stale whiskey and peppermint clinging to his breath. "I don't care about federal charges. I care about the $500. I have a gut feeling she didn't freeze out there. I have a gut feeling she found a warm hole to hide in." Ezekiel finally turned. He towered over the Pinkerton by 4 inches. His face was a mask of cold, carved stone. "My mountain is private property, Briggs. The trail up the ridge is steep, and there's a lot of loose rock. Men slip and fall all the time." Briggs smiled, a thin, ugly stretching of his lips. The scar tissue around his neck pulled tight. "I'm sure-footed mountain man. I'll be seeing you." Ezekiel watched the detective walk back towards the saloon. He didn't rush. He finished tying down the tarp, mounted his roan, and pointed it back towards the mountain. He pushed the animals hard. The mud be damned. He knew Briggs wasn't a man to sit and wait. Briggs was a hound who had caught a scent. The sun was dropping below the jagged peaks when Ezekiel reached the clearing. The shadows in the canyon were stretching long and purple. The cabin door flew open before he had even dismounted. Joe stood on the porch. She looked at him, then at the loaded mule, and let out a breath she looked like she'd been holding all day. Ezekiel didn't smile. He swung down from the saddle. "Get your boots on," he said, his voice clipped and hard. "Pack the saddlebags. Meat bread blankets. Leave the rest." Joe froze. The relief on her face shattered, replaced instantly by the feral, cornered look she had worn the day she arrived. "What happened?" "Man in town. Pinkerton. He has a paper with your face on it and a $500 bounty. He knows you're up here." Ezekiel grabbed the mule's lead and hauled it toward the porch. "We're leaving. Up over the saddleback. We can make the old logging camp by midnight." Joe asked. Ezekiel stopped. He looked at her. "I'm not leaving you to him, Joe. Now pack." He turned back to unsaddle the roan, intending to swap the heavy stock saddle for the lighter riding rig. That was when the first dog barked. It was a sharp, aggressive yelp that was abruptly cut short by the booming crack of a heavy-caliber rifle echoing off the canyon walls. One of the wolfhounds dropped like a stone in the mud, a dark stain spreading across its thick grey coat. "Get inside," Ezekiel roared. He slapped the roan's flank, sending the horse bolting away from the line of fire, and dove behind the heavy wooden water trough near the porch. A second shot splintered the wood inches from his head, showering him with wet splinters and freezing water. Joe hadn't run inside. She hit the deck on the porch, rolling behind the thick stack of firewood near the door. "Where is he?" she yelled, the panic in her voice fighting against the adrenaline. Ezekiel peered through the crack between the trough and the ground. The shot had come from the tree line about 60 yards out. The light was dying fast, making the dark pines look like a solid wall of black. "Tree line!" Ezekiel shouted back. "Keep your head down." He drew the Colt Navy from his hip. It was useless at this range against a rifle, but he needed cover fire. He popped up over the trough and fired 3 rapid shots into the woods. Gunsmoke bloomed thick in the damp air. A third rifle shot slammed into the ground near Ezekiel's boot, spraying him with mud. The man was good. He was using a sharps or a rolling block, slow to reload, but devastatingly accurate. "Cole!" Briggs' raspy voice carried across the clearing, echoing slightly. "Send the girl out. I got no quarrel with you. $500, I'll split it with you." Ezekiel gritted his teeth. "Go to hell, Briggs. Suit yourself. I can wait all night. You'll freeze out here behind that trough." Briggs was right. Ezekiel had left his heavy coat on the saddle. The mud was seeping through his clothes. If he tried to make a run for the cabin door, Briggs would put a bullet through his spine. He heard a scraping sound from the porch. Ezekiel risked a glance backward. Joe was crawling on her belly, inching her way towards the cabin door. "Joe, stay down," he hissed. She ignored him. She reached up, twisted the brass knob, and pushed the heavy door open. She vanished inside. Ezekiel cursed under his breath. He checked his cylinder. 3 rounds left. He needed to draw Briggs' fire, make him waste a shot, and then charge the tree line before the Pinkerton could reload. It was a stupid, desperate plan, but it was all he had. Before he could move, the cabin door kicked open again. Joe stepped out. She wasn't crawling. She was standing tall, and tucked tight against her right shoulder was Ezekiel's Winchester repeating rifle. "Hey, Scarneck!" Joe screamed into the twilight. A shadow shifted in the trees. Briggs was adjusting his aim, swinging the heavy barrel toward the new target on the porch. Joe didn't flinch. She racked the lever of the Winchester, the mechanical clack loud and distinct. She brought the sights up, braced her stance, and pulled the trigger. The recoil punched her shoulder back, but she racked it again. And again. She fired 4 times in rapid succession, laying down a wall of lead straight into the brush, where the shadow had moved. Bark shattered. Pine branches snapped. Briggs fired wild, the heavy bullet slamming into the cabin wall, 5 feet to Joe's left. "Ezekiel, go!" she screamed, racking the lever a 5th time. Ezekiel didn't hesitate. The moment Briggs fired, Ezekiel launched himself over the trough. He sprinted across the muddy yard, his boots digging into the slush. He closed the 60 yards in seconds, the mud flying behind him. He hit the tree line like a freight train. Briggs was scrambling backward in the brush, desperately trying to shove a fresh paper cartridge into the breech of his rifle. He looked up, his eyes widening as the mountain man descended on him. Briggs dropped the rifle and clawed for the revolver at his hip. Ezekiel didn't shoot. He slammed into the Pinkerton, a tackle that drove the breath from Briggs' lungs with a sickening crack. They crashed into the mud and wet pine needles. Briggs thrashed his hands, coming up, grabbing a handful of dirt and throwing it into Ezekiel's eyes. Ezekiel roared, blinded, but his hands found the thick, scarred throat. Briggs choked, pulling a hidden boot knife and burying it into the meat of Ezekiel's thigh. Pain flared white-hot and blinding, but Ezekiel didn't let go. He leveraged his weight, pinned the man's knife arm down with his knee, and brought his right fist down the fist attached to the shoulder he had spent all winter healing. He hit Briggs once, a brutal, crushing blow to the jaw. Briggs' head snapped to the side, hitting the trunk of a pine tree with a dull thud. The Pinkerton went entirely limp. Ezekiel stayed pinned on top of him for a long moment, breathing in ragged, gasping heaves. The woods went dead silent save for the drip of melting snow. Slowly, Ezekiel wiped the mud from his eyes. He looked down at the unconscious man. He pulled the knife from his own leg, wincing as fresh blood soaked his trousers. He tossed the blade into the dark. Footsteps sloshed in the mud behind him. Ezekiel turned. Jo was standing at the edge of the trees. The Winchester was still in her hands, the barrel smoking in the cold air. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She looked at Ezekiel, bleeding and covered in mud, and then down at the bounty hunter. "Is he dead?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "No," Ezekiel grunted, pushing himself up off the man. He limped heavily, putting weight on his good leg. "But he'll have a headache for a month." Jo lowered the rifle. She let out a long, shaky breath and stepped forward, offering him her hand to help him balance. Ezekiel looked at her hand. It was the same hand she had used to fire the rifle to save his life. The same hand she had used to make terrible bread all winter. He took it. "Come on." Ezekiel said, his grip tight and grounding. "Let's go patch that dog. Then we need to ride. The spring is going to be busy." The greyhound was breathing, but just barely. Ezekiel knelt in the mud of the yard, his own blood soaking the heavy denim of his trousers. The dog lay on its side, whining a high, thin sound of terror and pain. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of the animal's neck, missing the artery and the spine, but it was bleeding heavily. Jo dropped the Winchester on the porch and ran inside. She returned a moment later with an armful of clean flour sacks and the bottle of cheap rye whiskey Ezekiel kept for toothaches. "Hold his head," Jo ordered. Ezekiel didn't argue. He clamped his heavy mud-caked hands gently around the hound's snout and ears, murmuring low, gravelly nonsense words. Jo poured the rye directly into the wound. The dog thrashed a violent spasm of agony, but Ezekiel held him firm. Jo packed the flour sacks tight against the entry and exit holes, wrapping a leather strap around the dog's thick neck to hold the makeshift bandages in place. "He'll live," she said, her hands coated in canine blood. She looked up at Ezekiel. "Your turn." "I'm fine. We need to tie up the Pinkerton." "You're leaving a puddle in the mud-coal." Jo stood up, grabbing the whiskey bottle. She looked down at the dark, pulsing stain on his thigh. "Pants down. Now." Ezekiel grimaced. He leaned back against the water trough and unbuckled his belt. The knife had gone in deep, right into the thick muscle of the outer thigh. It was a dirty wound, jagged and ugly. Jo didn't hesitate. She poured the rest of the whiskey over the gash. Ezekiel's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck stood out like iron cables, but he didn't make a sound. Jo bound his leg tight with the remaining flour sacks, tying the knot with a vicious, necessary strength. "That's going to need stitching. And fire. Later." Ezekiel rasped, pulling himself up. The pain was blinding, a hot spike driving into his hip with every step. Grab the rope from the shed. They found Briggs exactly where Ezekiel had left him, slumped against the base of a pine tree, groaning as consciousness slowly returned. Joe bound his hands behind his back with thick hemp rope, pulling the knots tight enough to bite into the Pinkerton's wrists. She looped the other end around the tree trunk. Briggs spat a mouthful of blood and pine needles. He looked up at Joe, his eyes out of focus but full of venom. "You're just delaying the rope, girl. I'll be coming." Joe stepped close to him. She didn't look like the terrified woman on the wanted poster anymore. She looked like the mountain. "It's a 10-mile walk down to Red Creek, Briggs. The mud is deep. I suggest you start thinking about your boots instead of my neck." She turned her back on him and walked away. Ezekiel had the roan and the mule saddled. He hoisted the injured hound into one of the empty canvas panniers, on the mule padding it with blankets. The other dog, sensing the urgency, paced nervously around the horses. "Mount up," Ezekiel said. He was leaning heavily against the roan's shoulder, his face pale beneath the dirt and soot. "You can't ride," Joe said, catching the reins. "You're bleeding through the bandage." "I can ride. I have to." He grabbed the saddle horn and hauled himself up. A choked grunt escaped his lips as his weight settled into the stirrups. He swayed for a second, the world tilting, before he locked his jaw and grabbed the reins. Joe swung up onto the mule. She looked back at the cabin. The door was still open. The fire was burning in the hearth. It was the only place she had felt safe in a year, and now she was leaving it to the wind and the ghosts. "Where to?" she asked. "Up." Ezekiel pointed toward the jagged silhouette of the Saddleback Ridge barely visible against the night sky. "There's an old logging camp 5 miles over the crest. If we make it there, the rock will hide our tracks from the mud." They rode into the dark. The ascent was brutal. The spring thaw had turned the trail into a sluice of freezing water and loose scree. The horses slipped and scrambled, their hooves striking sparks against the hidden granite. The air grew thinner, the temperature dropping steadily as they climbed back above the snow line. Ezekiel rode in silence. Joe watched his back. With every mile, his posture slumped a fraction more. The stoic, immovable mountain man was bleeding out, dropping pieces of his strength on the rocks behind them. The Pinkerton's knife had been coated in boot-blacking dirt and rust. By the time they crested the ridge, a freezing rain had begun to fall, a miserable, driving sleet that cut through their clothes and chilled them to the marrow. Ezekiel's horse stumbled. Ezekiel didn't catch the reins in time. He pitched forward, sliding out of the saddle and crashing heavily into the frozen slush. "Ezekiel!" Joe slid off the mule before it had even stopped. She ran to him. He was lying on his back, staring up at the freezing rain. His skin was burning hot to the touch, a raging fever having set in with terrifying speed. "Get up," she pleaded, grabbing his coat. "Cole, you have to get up. The camp is close." Ezekiel looked at her. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Should have used less flour." He mumbled, "Don't do that. Don't check out on me now." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She hooked her arms under his armpits and hauled backward. He was deadweight 200 pounds of solid muscle and heavy winter clothing. "Ezekiel, please!" She screamed into the wind. Something in her voice pierced the fever haze. Ezekiel blinked. He dug his good heel into the slush and pushed. Together, agonizingly slow, they got him upright. He draped his heavy arm over her shoulder, crushing her under his weight, and they staggered forward into the dark, the horses trailing blindly behind them. The logging camp was a graveyard of ambition. 6 collapsed timber shacks sat rotting in a shallow bowl near the tree line, surrounded by rusted saw blades and the decaying skeletons of forgotten wagons. Joe aimed for the largest structure, a longhouse that had miraculously retained most of its roof. She kicked the door open. It smelled of rat droppings, damp earth, and ancient pine pitch. It was dry enough. She dragged Ezekiel inside and let him slide to the dirt floor. He didn't move. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering with the fever. Joe moved with frantic, mechanical efficiency. Survival was a rhythm she knew. She stripped the dry blankets from the mule, brought the dogs inside, and barricaded the door. She found a rusted iron stove in the corner of the room, its chimney pipe miraculously still attached to the roof. She broke apart a rotting chair and fed it into the stove using the dry gunpowder from Ezekiel's flask to spark a fire. Within minutes, heat began to push back the freezing damp. She knelt beside Ezekiel. She pulled his heavy coat off, unbuttoned his soaked shirt, and dragged him closer to the stove. Then she took her new bone-handled knife and cut his trousers open, exposing the wound. It was bad. The skin around the gash was swollen, angry red, and radiating a sickly heat. The bleeding had slowed to a dark, sluggish ooze, but the infection was racing through his blood. Jo sat back on her heels. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose timbers of the shack. She was a runaway convict. She forged paper. She didn't know how to pull a man back from the edge of the grave. She looked at Ezekiel's face. The harsh lines were softened by unconsciousness, the deep scar on his cheek, pale against his flushed skin. He had taken a bullet meant for her. He had fought a Pinkerton with his bare hands to buy her time. "All right, Cole," she whispered. "You fix the heavy lifting. I'll fix this." She took the bone-handled knife and held the blade directly over the hottest coals in the stove. She waited until the steel glowed a dull cherry red. She grabbed a clean rag from the saddlebags and tore it into strips. She filled a tin cup with snow and set it on the stove to boil. Ezekiel groaned as she rolled him onto his side. "Hold still," she ordered, her voice shaking despite her resolve. She took a piece of the leather rein she had cut and wedged it between his teeth. Then, taking a deep breath, she pressed the red-hot blade of the knife directly into the infected wound. The smell of burning flesh and boiling blood filled the small cabin. Ezekiel woke up. His body arched off the floor in pure, unadulterated agony. A muffled scream tore through the leather rein. His hands flew out, gripping Jo's arms with a force that would leave deep bruises, but she didn't flinch. She held the iron to the wound, burning away the rot, cauterizing the severed vessels. "I know." She sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "I know, Ezekiel. Just a second more." She pulled the knife away. Ezekiel collapsed back onto the dirt, gasping, his chest heaving. The violent shivering stopped, replaced by a cold, heavy sweat. Jo tossed the knife aside. She used the boiled water to wash the charred skin, then packed the wound tight with clean rags, binding it securely. When she was finished, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely strike a match to light a lantern. She sat on the dirt beside him, pulling the heavy wool blankets over his chest. The injured hound limped over and curled up against Ezekiel's good leg, resting its heavy head on the blankets. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Jo fed it mechanically, watching the rise and fall of Ezekiel's chest. The fever was fighting a losing battle against his immense physical constitution. Sometime near dawn, his breathing leveled out. The heat radiating from his skin began to cool. Jo slumped against the wall, utterly spent. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on her arms, watching him. "Jo." The voice was a dry croak, barely louder than the crackle of the wood. She jerked her head up. Ezekiel's eyes were open. They were clear. Tired, pain-filled, but clear. She scrambled over to him, grabbing the tin cup of water and holding it to his lips. He drank, greedily coughing as the water hit his parched throat. "Easy," she murmured, wiping his chin. He fell back against the bundled saddlebags she had used as a pillow. He looked at his leg, at the neat, tight bandages, and then up at her. He saw the soot on her face, the blood on her hands, the absolute exhaustion in her eyes. "You burned it," he said. "Had to. The knife was dirty." Ezekiel nodded slowly. He didn't say thank you. The words were too small for the room. He reached out with his massive, calloused hand and wrapped his fingers around her wrist. Not the wrist with the fading shackle scar, but the other one. His thumb brushed over her pulse. It was a grounding touch. A tether. "Briggs?" he asked. "Tied to a tree. He's freezing, but he'll live. I doubt he's eager to climb the saddleback in the mud." "He'll telegraph the marshal." "Let him." Joe looked down at his hand holding hers. She didn't pull away. "We're a long way from Red Creek." Ezekiel studied her face in the dim morning light, filtering through the cracks in the walls. "You could have kept riding, Joe. Once you got me up here, you could have taken the mule and the money box and rode into the desert." "I could have," she agreed softly. "Why didn't you—" Joe looked up, meeting his steady gaze. The cynicism and the fear that had defined her for a year were gone, burned away in the fire of the long night. "Because I'm tired of running alone," she said. "And because I need a mountain man, even a stubborn one." Ezekiel's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. His thumb stroked her wrist one last time before he closed his eyes, surrendering to the exhaustion. "Wake me in 4 hours. We ride at noon." Joe sat beside him as the sun rose, the golden light breaking through the clouds and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder. It took them 3 days to cross the high ridge and descend into the vast, sprawling basin of the high desert. The transition was jarring. The claustrophobic verticality of the mountains gave way to an endless ocean of pale green sagebrush red dust, and a sky so big it made a person feel insignificant. The mud dried out, turning to hardpan. The freezing rain became a warm, relentless wind that smelled of wild thyme and sun-baked rock. They were out of the territory. They were out of Pinkerton jurisdiction, out of martial territory in the lawless, empty stretch of land where men with pasts went to become men with no names. They set up camp near a shallow, muddy creek lined with stunted cottonwoods. Ezekiel was walking with a heavy limp, using a thick branch of mountain ash as a cane. The wound was healing, knitting together with the stubborn resilience of a man who refused to die, but it would leave a scar to match the one on his shoulder and the one on his face. He sat by the fire, whittling down the rough edges of his cane with his pocket knife. Joe was at the edge of the creek, scrubbing the last of the blood out of his trousers against a flat rock. The injured hound bandage, finally removed, was splashing in the shallows, chasing frogs with half its usual speed, but all its usual enthusiasm. Joe wrung the trousers out, draped them over a cottonwood branch to dry, and walked back to the fire. She sat down on a log opposite Ezekiel. She watched him work the wood. The comfortable silence between them had solidified into something permanent. They didn't need to fill the air with words. Ezekiel closed his knife and slipped it into his pocket. He reached behind him, pulling the heavy black iron lockbox from his saddlebags. He set it on the dirt between them. Joe stared at it. The box that had tempted her for months. The box that represented freedom. Ezekiel reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small brass key. He tossed it. It landed in the dust at her feet. "Open it," he said. Joe looked from the key to his face. "Ezekiel, open it, Joe." She hesitated, then leaned forward, picked up the key and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. She threw the latch back and lifted the heavy iron lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were stacks of $20 gold double eagles. It was a small fortune. More money than Joe had ever seen in one place. Enough to buy passage to Europe, or a grand house in San Francisco. "There's $1,200 in there." Ezekiel said, his voice flat and even. "Pelt money. Bounty money from before I came up the mountain. Poker winnings. Blood money." Joe touched the cool gold. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because we're at the edge of the map." Ezekiel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You said you were tired of running alone. So am I. But I'm not dragging you through the dirt forever, Joe. This life looking over your shoulder, jumping at shadows, it eats a person alive." He pointed to the box. That buys a fresh start, a deed under a different name, a couple 100 acres in Oregon or down in Sonora, a herd of cattle, a real stove. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. I can't offer you a clean slate, Josephine. I got too much blood on my hands for that. But I can offer you a quiet piece of dirt where nobody will ever come looking. Joe sat perfectly still. The wind rustled the dry leaves of the cottonwoods. The hound barked happily in the distance. She looked at the gold. She thought of the judge. She thought of the cold, dark cell in the territorial prison. She thought of Briggs and his rope. Then she looked at Ezekiel. She saw the man who had eaten burnt stew without complaining. The man who had stood between her and a bullet. The man who had let her burn him to save his life. She didn't want San Francisco. She didn't want Europe. Joe reached into the box. She didn't take the gold. She picked up the heavy iron lid and slammed it shut. The loud crack echoed across the quiet desert. She picked up the brass key, leaned across the fire, and pressed it firmly into Ezekiel's calloused palm, closing his fingers around it. Oregon is too wet, she said, her voice steady and clear. And I don't speak Spanish well enough for Sonora. Ezekiel looked at his closed fist, then up at her. Where then? Joe looked out over the vast, empty expanse of the high desert. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple and burning orange. It was beautiful, harsh, and utterly unforgiving. It looked exactly like them. Right here is fine, she said. Find a valley with good water and high walls. We build a cabin, a real one with a floor that isn't dirt. You can run cattle? She offered him a small, wry smile. And I'll learn how to bake a loaf of bread that doesn't double as a doorstop. Ezekiel Cole, the outcast mountain man, the ghost of Red Creek, looked at the escaped convict who had walked up his mountain to steal his money and save his life. For the first time since the day he killed a man in Abilene, he smiled. It was a rough, unpracticed expression, but it changed his entire face, making him look young, alive, and fiercely human. All right, he said softly, putting the key in his pocket. Right here is fine. He reached across the space between them and pulled her hand into his. His grip was warm, rough, and solid as iron. They sat there as the stars began to prick through the fading light. Two outcasts at the edge of the world building a fire that no winter storm and no badge could ever put out. The fire in the hearth can keep a body warm for an hour, but it takes more than burning wood to thaw a frozen soul. Ezekiel and Joe survived the winter by surviving each other, finding humanity in the harshest of places, and building a life in the quiet spaces between the law and the lawless. If this story of outcasts, redemption, and the rugged frontier struck a chord with you, drop a like and leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done in Ezekiel's boots. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow story lovers and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a tale from the wild, untamed West.